The soft whirring of medical machines filled the sterile room. It was the kind of sound that, after a year of listening to it, had become almost comforting, familiar, predictable. Yet, to Dr. Michael Sanchez, there was nothing comforting about this place. Nothing about Sarah Whitaker's room could ever feel comforting again. Her hospital bed, set against the stark white walls, was surrounded by quiet monitors, each of them tracking something: her heartbeat, her breathing, her vitals. But it had been over a year now since Sarah had opened her eyes. No one really knew what had happened to her. She had been found unconscious in her luxurious penthouse apartment, no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. Just a wealthy, successful woman, suddenly stricken down by a mystery no one had ever solved. Her family, once hopeful, had long since abandoned any hope of her waking up. They'd moved on with their lives, leaving her to the nurses and doctors, as if Sarah were just another case file, another statistic in a long line of unsolved medical mysteries. But for Dr. Michael Sanchez, it was different. He had never been able to shake the image of her from his mind, her beauty, her charisma. She had once been a well-known figure in the city's business world. Her rise from humble beginnings to the heights of wealth and power was something everyone admired. People had called her a self-made millionaire, someone who had fought for everything she had. But now, here she was. Lifeless. Almost forgotten. It was an odd feeling, knowing that she had once been a force to be reckoned with, and now she was simply a shell of that person. That is, until this morning. Michael wasn't sure why he had volunteered to change her bandage, of all things. It wasn't part of his routine. It wasn't his turn. But something had tugged at him, a strange, unexplainable feeling that maybe, just maybe, this morning would be different. Maybe today, she would wake up. His fingers gripped the edge of the sterile bandage as he slowly began to peel it away from her chest. The sight of her, pale, unmoving, had become all too familiar over the months. But as he carefully removed the old dressing, something unexpected happened. He froze. It wasn't a sound, not at first. It was a feeling. Something was different. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it was as if the very air in the room had shifted. Sarah's body, which had been motionless for so long, seemed to respond to his touch in a way he couldn't explain. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make his heart race. Then it happened. Her fingers twitched. It wasn't a big movement. Just a slight twitch, like a flicker of life, a hint of motion. But it was enough to stop Michael dead in his tracks. He stared at her hand, unsure of what he had just seen. Was it a muscle spasm? A reflex? Or had she? His pulse quickened. There was no way. This woman had been in a coma for over a year. The doctors had all said the same thing: brain activity was minimal, almost non-existent. There was no way she could have moved on her own. But there it was, her hand twitching, as if responding to his touch. A cold sweat broke out on the back of Michael's neck as he watched. His breath caught in his throat. Should he call for help? Should he leave her to the professionals? He wasn't sure what to do, but he knew he couldn't stand here, frozen in disbelief. Not now. Not when something had just happened. He leaned in closer, his heart hammering in his chest. He gently touched her hand, unsure of what he was hoping for. A sign. A response. Anything. That's when he heard it. A faint whisper. Soft. Almost imperceptible. But it was there. He heard it clearly, the words unmistakable in the silence of the room. Help me. His blood ran cold. He stepped back, his mind racing, his thoughts swirling in a storm of confusion. Was he hallucinating? Was it possible that he had just heard what he thought he heard? Had Sarah Whitaker, the woman who had been in a coma for over a year, just spoken? Help me. The words echoed in his mind, louder now, as if they were an urgent plea. He stared at her, waiting for another movement, another sign. But the machines continued their monotonous beeping, the rhythm of her life unchanged. Had he imagined it? Was his mind playing tricks on him? Or had something truly extraordinary just happened? A long moment passed. He stared at Sarah, unsure of what to do next. His hand was still hovering above hers, but he didn't dare touch her again. What if it was just his mind playing tricks on him? What if he was wrong? But then, he heard it again. A small, soft sound. Almost like a gasp. His heart skipped a beat. She was breathing differently now. The rhythm of her breaths had changed. It wasn't the shallow, steady rhythm of someone who was simply alive by machine. It was deeper, more natural. It was almost as if she were waking up. Before Michael could do anything, the door to the room suddenly swung open, and a nurse rushed in, her eyes wide with concern. "Dr. Sanchez, is everything all right?" Michael blinked, suddenly aware of the chaos in his mind. He turned to her, his voice shaky as he spoke. She moved. Her fingers, they twitched. And she said something. She said, "Help me." The nurse's expression didn't change. She stepped forward and checked Sarah's vitals, her movements quick and professional. "Doctor, she's still in a coma. I'm sure it was just a reflex. Let's not jump to conclusions." But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened. He looked down at Sarah's face, her features still as lifeless as ever, yet something about her expression had changed. There was a subtle shift, a faint hint of something beneath the surface, something he couldn't quite understand. The nurse's voice broke through his thoughts. "Dr. Sanchez, let's take a step back. We'll monitor her closely, but she hasn't shown any signs of waking up. Let's not get ahead of ourselves." Michael nodded, though his gut told him something was terribly wrong. As the nurse began making notes on her clipboard, he stepped away from the bed. He couldn't explain it, but he felt a pull toward Sarah, a need to know the truth. What had just happened? Was she truly waking up? Or was there something more at play here than anyone could understand? As he stood in the room, staring at Sarah's still form, his mind raced with questions. Had she heard him? Was she aware of what had just happened? Or had she been trying to communicate something deeper, something more urgent than anyone could imagine? The seconds dragged on, and Michael's thoughts became a whirlwind. He couldn't leave it like this. He couldn't walk away without knowing more. Without understanding what had just transpired. And yet, as the nurse prepared to leave, she shot him one last glance. "We'll keep an eye on her. But, Dr. Sanchez, don't let yourself get caught up in what might just be a coincidence." But Michael wasn't so sure. Was it a coincidence? Or had Sarah Whitaker, the woman who had been lying lifeless for over a year, just given him a sign? The answer to that question would change everything. Days passed after the strange incident in Sarah Whitaker's hospital room. Dr. Michael Sanchez couldn't shake the feeling of something being off. He had seen comas before. He had seen the most severe cases, the near-impossible situations, but never had he encountered anything like what had happened that day. Was it just a spasm? A random flicker of life that would eventually fade away? Or was Sarah truly awakening? The days following that incident were tense, filled with the kind of anticipation that Michael had never felt before. He went about his routine, seeing patients, checking vitals, discussing cases with colleagues, but his mind always returned to Sarah. Every time he passed her room, his gaze would flicker toward her door. He couldn't stop thinking about her, wondering if that small twitch had been a sign of something greater, something inexplicable. Had she truly tried to speak to him? Michael tried to push the thought aside. He had a job to do. There were real cases in front of him, patients who needed his attention, who required his care. But Sarah's face, her pale expression, haunted him. Then, it happened again. On the 5th day after the incident, Michael was scheduled to change Sarah's bandages once more. This time, he was more prepared for the situation, but nothing could have prepared him for what would unfold in that small, sterile room. He entered her room in the late morning, the hospital's fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow over everything. The smell of antiseptic lingered in the air, as it always did. He had already mentally prepared himself to approach Sarah as if nothing had happened, to do his duty and move on. But deep down, a nagging feeling told him that he couldn't just let it go. He needed to know. As he approached her bed, the stillness of her body hit him once again. Despite the machines that hummed around her, Sarah remained completely motionless. Her chest rose and fell in a shallow, rhythmic pattern, the barest signs of life. Yet, despite the lack of movement, Michael couldn't ignore the strange sensation that always lingered when he was near her. It was as if the room itself held its breath, waiting for something to happen. Taking a deep breath, Michael carefully removed the sterile bandages that were covering her abdomen. He had done this countless times before, yet today, everything felt different. The weight of his hands seemed to carry a heavier meaning. He wasn't just performing a routine task anymore, he was searching for answers. What was it that had made her move? What had caused that whisper? His thoughts were interrupted as he felt her hand twitch again. This time, there was no doubt. The movement was deliberate, purposeful. Sarah's fingers clenched slightly before relaxing, as if she was consciously trying to move them. Michael's breath caught in his throat. Was she awake? Was she aware? His hands froze mid-motion. The bandage was still half off, but he couldn't focus on anything except Sarah's hand. "Help me." The voice was weak, barely audible. Michael's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't a dream, it wasn't his imagination. Sarah Whitaker had spoken again. He dropped the bandage and rushed to her side. His hands shook as he took her wrist gently in his grip. Her skin was cold, and he couldn't help but notice the contrast between her frailty and the fire he now felt building in his chest. He wanted answers. More than anything, he needed to know if she was truly conscious, if she was aware of her surroundings. "Sarah?" His voice cracked as he whispered her name, unsure if she could hear him, unsure if she could respond. For a long moment, nothing happened. But then, with a slight tremor, Sarah's eyelids fluttered. Michael's breath caught in his throat. Was it really happening? Were her eyes going to open? Her eyes, once clouded and still, began to blink. Slowly, painfully, her gaze fixed on him, a dull, almost confused expression on her face. And then, without warning, she whispered again. "Who are you?" Michael's heart soared. He had never expected this. Not in a million years. The woman he had known only as a figure of mystery, reduced to an image in the media, a woman no one had seen awake in over a year, was finally speaking. And the first words out of her mouth weren't just some random question, they were a plea. A request for help. "I'm Dr. Michael Sanchez," he said gently, his voice full of wonder, yet careful not to alarm her. "I'm a doctor here. I've been taking care of you." Her eyes searched his face. But there was no recognition. No flicker of familiarity. Just a blank, searching gaze. "Why am I here?" Her voice was barely audible, as though every word took an immense amount of effort. Michael fought the urge to panic. He knew how delicate this moment was. Every doctor was taught that comatose patients, especially ones who had been in a coma as long as Sarah had, could be unpredictable. They could suddenly regain consciousness, only to fall back into the coma. Or worse, they could experience a cognitive disconnect, not knowing who they were or where they were. "You've been in a coma for over a year, Sarah," Michael said gently. "You were found unconscious. You haven't woken up until now." She blinked slowly, processing his words, as if she couldn't understand them fully. A year. Her voice faltered as if the idea of time itself was alien to her. Why, can't I remember? Michael swallowed hard. The questions were already piling up in his mind. What had caused her to fall into the coma in the first place? Was this truly a case of waking up after a long absence, or was something more sinister at play? Do you remember anything before the coma? He asked cautiously. Anything at all? She shook her head weakly, her eyes drifting to the side. No, nothing. Michael stood still, trying to process the situation. He had read about cases like this. But he had never experienced anything quite like this. No one had. The medical world was already scrambling for answers, but they didn't have one. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. There was something about Sarah's awakening that didn't sit right with him. Something more than just the mystery of her coma. Just as Michael opened his mouth to speak again, Sarah's eyes widened, and she let out a sharp gasp. Dr. Sanchez, she whispered urgently, her voice trembling. The man in my dreams. He's real, isn't he? The blood in Michael's veins turned cold. He wasn't sure if he had heard her right. The man in your dreams, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, her breath shaky. He's been coming to me, in my dreams. But they aren't just dreams. They're real. He's real, and he's been watching me. Michael felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't something they had prepared for. This wasn't something any medical journal could explain. Who was the man Sarah was talking about? Was this some kind of hallucination, or was there a deeper mystery at play? As Sarah's eyes filled with fear, Michael realized that this was only the beginning. There was so much more to this than he had initially thought. The waking of Sarah Whitaker from her year-long coma was only one piece of the puzzle. But what was the bigger picture? What was the truth behind her fall into the coma, the strange dreams, and the man who seemed to be haunting her even in her unconscious state? He had no answers. But one thing was certain. This mystery was far from over. And Michael Sanchez was going to get to the bottom of it, no matter the cost. As Sarah's breathing became heavier, her gaze distant, Michael knew they had just scratched the surface of something much darker. Something that would shake them both to their core. The hospital room was quiet, save for the hum of machines that tracked Sarah Whitaker's breathing, her pulse, the steady beat of her heart. Dr. Michael Sanchez sat in the chair next to her bed, his fingers gently gripping the edge of the sheet. His mind was racing. Sarah's awakening was nothing short of extraordinary, but the details, those haunting words she had spoken, her terrified gaze, were what he couldn't shake. She had claimed that the man in her dreams was real. And that was something that Michael, as a trained medical professional, couldn't simply dismiss. After all, dreams are often a reflection of what's happening in our subconscious. But Sarah's words had not been the ramblings of a confused mind, they had been too deliberate, too full of terror. And that man, whoever he was, had been haunting her even when she was unconscious. Michael stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. The bustling streets below were a far cry from the stillness of Sarah's room. But his mind was not on the outside world, it was with her, in the room. He replayed her words over and over again in his head, the man in my dreams, he's real, isn't he? A chill ran down his spine as he thought about it. He had seen patients with vivid dreams, ones that felt incredibly real to them, but none had ever described anything like this. A man coming to them in their sleep, watching them from the shadows, whispering words that would make anyone's skin crawl. Was this just a symptom of the trauma her brain had endured while she had been in the coma? Or was something else going on? He turned away from the window, deciding it was time to speak to Sarah again. He needed to get more information. The only way to understand what was happening was to dig deeper. If she was truly awake, truly aware, he couldn't let her slip back into silence. Not without getting some answers. Sarah had drifted back into a shallow sleep when Michael returned to her side. Her eyes were closed, but her brows were furrowed in a way that suggested she wasn't at ease. She was restless, even in her sleep. Her body twitched occasionally, as if she was trying to escape some unseen presence. He took a seat again, his gaze fixed on her face. Her skin, pale and fragile, looked like it had been drained of all color, but there was something in her eyes, something raw, desperate, that made him feel like he was seeing a side of her no one else had ever witnessed. This was no ordinary coma recovery. This was something entirely different. For a while, he sat there, just watching her, his thoughts swirling with more questions than he had answers. But soon, he couldn't stand the silence any longer. He needed to know more. "Sarah," he said softly, leaning forward, "when you say the man in your dreams is real, can you tell me more? What does he look like? What does he do?" Sarah's eyelids fluttered as if she was fighting against her own exhaustion, but she opened her eyes, her gaze locking with his. There was a moment of hesitation before she spoke. "He's always there," she said in a whisper, her voice thick with fear. "In my dreams, I see him standing in the corner of my room. He's tall, his face, it's always hidden in shadows. I can never see him clearly, but I know he's watching me. I can feel it. I know he's there." Her breath hitched, and her hands gripped the sheets tightly, her knuckles white. "And sometimes, when I try to wake up, when I try to scream, he touches me. But it's not like any touch I've ever felt. It's cold. Like ice." Michael felt a cold shiver run down his spine as Sarah's words sank in. He couldn't explain what she was describing. A man hiding in the shadows, touching her in her sleep? It sounded like the kind of thing that could come straight from a nightmare. But what if it wasn't? "What does he want from you?" Michael asked, his voice steady, trying to keep his emotions in check. She closed her eyes, her face contorting with fear. "I don't know," she whispered. "He never says anything to me. He just watches. And sometimes, I hear his voice, but it's faint, like a whisper in the wind. It's always the same. You can't escape." Michael's heart raced, and he couldn't help the surge of fear that filled him. What could this mean? Was Sarah's coma connected to this man? Was he real, or was this just a figment of her mind trying to make sense of her time in the coma? "Has he ever done anything to you while you were awake?" Michael asked cautiously, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. Sarah's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, she looked almost ashamed. "No, not really," she said, almost apologetically. "But I feel him. Every time I'm alone, I feel his presence. It's like he's watching me, waiting." A heavy silence filled the room. Michael leaned back in his chair, his thoughts racing. There had to be a logical explanation for this. There had to be. But at the same time, part of him couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling that gnawed at him. Something about Sarah's story didn't sit right. It didn't feel like a simple psychological reaction to her long coma. There was something deeper at play here, something he couldn't explain. His mind wandered back to her coma, to the day she had been found. No one had been able to explain it. No signs of trauma, no signs of poisoning, no reason for her to have fallen into such a deep, unexplained state. And then, when she had woken up, it wasn't just the physical recovery. It was the strange whispering in her sleep, the talk of a man who was somehow connected to her dreams. It all felt too bizarre to be coincidence. "Michael?" Sarah's voice interrupted his thoughts, pulling him back into the present. He turned to look at her, surprised by the way she had said his name. There was a familiarity in her voice now, a sense of recognition that hadn't been there before. "Yes?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I know this sounds crazy," she began, her voice trembling, "but I need to know something. You said I've been in a coma for over a year, right?" That I haven't woken up at all? She paused, studying him with a mixture of hope and fear. Then why don't I remember anything about what happened before? Michael swallowed, trying to think of a way to answer that question. It was a valid one. In all the months that she had been unconscious, no one had been able to provide an answer to Sarah's question. Why had she fallen into a coma in the first place? Why had her body gone into such an extreme state of unresponsiveness without any external cause? I don't know, Michael admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. There's no explanation, Sarah. I wish I had an answer for you. But I don't. Her eyes softened as she looked at him. But, you believe me, don't you? You believe that something is happening to me? That this man, that he's not just in my head? Michael hesitated. His instincts told him there was something more at play here, but as a doctor, he was trained to look for logical explanations. He had seen strange things in his time, patients with vivid hallucinations, victims of trauma who experienced unusual psychological phenomena, but none of them had ever described anything like this. I believe that something is going on, he said, choosing his words carefully. And I promise you, I'm going to figure it out. There was a pause as Sarah stared at him, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded, as if some small weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Thank you, she whispered. But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that they were both walking down a path that would lead them to something far darker than either of them could imagine. The man in her dreams, the shadow that haunted her every night, wasn't just a figment of her imagination. Something about this was real. And it wasn't just her mind playing tricks on her. As Michael sat in the quiet room, watching Sarah's slow, uneven breaths, he realized that whatever had happened to Sarah Whitaker, a year ago, or even before, wasn't just a medical mystery. It was something far more sinister. And he was about to find out what. Dr. Michael Sanchez couldn't sleep. The quiet of the hospital was a stark contrast to the chaos of his thoughts. He sat at the small desk in his office, his fingers nervously tapping against the wooden surface as his eyes flicked over the files spread out in front of him. There was something about Sarah Whitaker's case that felt wrong, something he couldn't explain. Her awakening from the coma was extraordinary enough, but the man in her dreams, the way she spoke about him as though he were real, as though he were someone or something tangible, had unsettled Michael in ways he couldn't shake. The files in front of him were a mystery in themselves. Sarah had been admitted to the hospital over a year ago after being found unconscious in her luxury apartment. No signs of forced entry. No signs of struggle. No signs of trauma. Just a woman, comatose, as though her body had simply shut down without reason. The doctors had worked tirelessly to understand what had happened, but the cause of her condition remained a complete mystery. A few theories had been floated: poisoning, an unknown medical condition, even something as strange as a rare neurological disorder, but none of them held up under scrutiny. Michael read through the notes again, looking for something he might have missed, some small detail that could explain what had happened. He went over the timeline one more time. Sarah had collapsed at home, her body found lifeless. She'd been rushed to the hospital, and from the moment she arrived, it was clear there was no rational explanation for her condition. And then, a year later, she had awoken, just like that, with no warning, no gradual recovery, just sudden consciousness after being comatose for months. But it was the dreams, the whispers, the man in the shadows, that truly caught his attention. He had spent hours researching psychological phenomena and sleep disorders, but nothing matched Sarah's description. The way she spoke of the man was far beyond the ordinary hallucinations that sometimes accompany deep comas. It felt like something more, something deeper. Michael stood up abruptly, pushing the files aside. He needed to get out of the office, to clear his head. He needed a fresh perspective on the situation. The hospital was nearly empty at this hour. It was well past midnight, and only the night shift workers roamed the hallways. Michael made his way through the sterile corridors, his footsteps echoing softly in the silence. He couldn't stop thinking about Sarah. Her pale face, the fear in her eyes, the way she spoke of the man watching her. He didn't know what it meant, but he was determined to find out. As he approached Sarah's room, his thoughts turned to the question that had been eating away at him all night: why her? What made Sarah Whitaker the target of this mysterious presence? Why had she been chosen? He had to admit, the logical part of him was fighting against the strange sensations he had been feeling. Was this some sort of collective trauma? A manifestation of the mind's attempt to make sense of an inexplicable situation? Or was there something more? When he entered the room, Sarah was asleep again. Her breathing was steady, but her face was tense, her body twitching occasionally as though she was still fighting some unseen enemy in her dreams. Michael approached her bed slowly, sitting down in the chair next to her, watching her for a moment. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong about all of this. He had to get answers, he couldn't just sit here and wait for things to unfold. He had been with Sarah for hours the day before, trying to understand what she had experienced, trying to make sense of the man in her dreams. But he realized now that he needed to dig deeper. He needed to find out who this man was, why Sarah was the one who was experiencing these terrifying visions. He had to find the connection, no matter how strange or impossible it seemed. As he sat in the chair, his fingers drumming on the armrest, he noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. The shadow. It was the same shadow Sarah had described, the one that always lingered in the corner of the room. Michael froze, his heart racing. Was it a trick of the light? Was it just his tired eyes playing tricks on him? No. It wasn't a trick. He saw it again, clearer this time. A shape, moving, standing just outside the light of the room, lurking in the corner. It was as if it was watching him, waiting. He blinked, and when he looked again, it was gone. But the feeling, the presence, lingered in the air. Michael stood up quickly, his mind spinning. Was it possible? Was the man Sarah had described, the one in her dreams, truly here? And if so, why was he in the hospital? His pulse quickened as he approached the corner of the room, his eyes scanning the space. But there was nothing. Just the usual sterile, empty space of a hospital room. Yet, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was hidden just out of sight. He looked back at Sarah, her peaceful expression at odds with the fear that gripped his chest. He couldn't stand it anymore. He needed to get to the bottom of this. He was a doctor. He was supposed to deal with facts, with rational explanations. But this? This wasn't rational. And it wasn't something that could be explained away by medical journals or common sense. Michael reached for his phone, dialing the number he had been avoiding all day. "Dr. Sanchez," came the voice on the other end, groggy and tired. "Dr. Reed, it's Michael," he said urgently. "I need you to meet me. We have to talk about Sarah Whitaker. There's something. I think there's something going on here that no one is prepared for." The voice on the other end hesitated, and then answered, "What's going on, Michael? What's happened?" "I can't explain it over the phone," Michael said, his voice tight with urgency. "Meet me in the hospital lobby in 20 minutes. I need you here now." 20 minutes later, Dr. Reed arrived, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. He was Michael's senior, a seasoned doctor who had seen his fair share of strange cases, but even he had been baffled by Sarah's situation. "What's going on?" Dr. Reed asked. His tone serious as they walked down the hallway together. "I don't know," Michael admitted, his voice low. "But I need to talk to you about her coma. I think we missed something. Something crucial." Dr. Reed raised an eyebrow. "Missed something? You're telling me this isn't just a strange medical anomaly?" Michael shook his head. "No. There's something else going on here. Something that goes beyond what we know. I've been with her, and there's a presence. A figure. The man she's been describing, the one in her dreams, he's real, Dr. Reed. I'm sure of it. Dr. Reed stopped walking, his eyes narrowing. Michael, what are you talking about? Are you saying she's hallucinating? No, Michael said firmly. I'm saying I've seen it too. There's something here. Something that we don't understand. And it's connected to Sarah. Dr. Reed took a step back, his face unreadable. All right, he said slowly. Let's go see her. As they entered Sarah's room, Michael's nerves were on edge. He had no idea what to expect. Would the man in the shadows be there again? Would they see him too? Or was it all in Michael's mind? Was he losing his grip on reality, just like Sarah? They walked into the room, and Sarah was still asleep, her body twitching slightly. Michael's eyes scanned the room, but this time, he didn't see anything unusual. No shadows lurking. No figures in the corners. It's quiet, Dr. Reed said, his voice almost cautious. Maybe you're just overworked, Michael. You've been at this case for too long. Michael clenched his fists. He wanted to believe that. He wanted to believe this was just a result of stress and lack of sleep. But deep down, he knew something was happening. Something more than just a coincidence. Suddenly, Sarah's eyes fluttered open. She looked at Michael, and then at Dr. Reed, her face pale and strained. The man, she whispered hoarsely. He's here. I can feel him. Michael's heart skipped a beat. Dr. Reed's expression darkened. He looked at Michael, then back at Sarah, his brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean, Sarah? Michael asked, his voice trembling with anticipation. She turned her gaze to the corner of the room, her eyes wide with terror. He's standing there, watching. Just like always. Dr. Reed turned slowly, following her gaze. But there was nothing there. No shadow. No figure. Just the sterile hospital room. Sarah, there's nothing there, Michael said gently, his voice soft, trying to soothe her. But Sarah shook her head violently. He's there. He's always there. Don't you see him? Michael's pulse quickened. He had to get to the bottom of this. And he had to do it soon. For Sarah's sake. For his own. The answers were out there. Somewhere. But they were slipping away. The days following Sarah Whitaker's unsettling revelation felt like an endless spiral into confusion and uncertainty for Dr. Michael Sanchez. Despite his best efforts to maintain his composure, the truth was beginning to gnaw at him, a gnawing sense that something beyond his understanding was happening, something that medical science simply couldn't explain. The presence Sarah described, the figure in the shadows that she insisted was real, could not be ignored. And now, even Michael was beginning to question his own senses. It wasn't just Sarah's insistence anymore, it was his own mind, his own doubts, his growing unease. The more time he spent with her, the more it became apparent that there was an unexplainable connection between Sarah and whatever it was that haunted her. But Michael couldn't yet put the pieces together. He had seen the figure once, just as Sarah had described it, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just in her mind. There was something, or someone, lurking just beyond the veil of reality. After that last visit to Sarah's room, when she had again pointed to the corner of the room and insisted the figure was there, Michael had done everything he could to maintain a sense of normalcy. He reassured Dr. Reed that they would continue with their investigation, that they would figure this out. But deep down, he knew that the answers weren't going to come from the usual methods. The world he had known, one of diagnoses, treatments, and test results, was suddenly failing him. He was in uncharted territory. One night, after leaving the hospital, Michael found himself unable to sleep. His mind raced through a million questions, none of which had any clear answers. He knew he had to keep pushing, to keep seeking the truth, but where could he go next? He had spent weeks combing through Sarah's medical records, researching every possible condition that might explain her coma and subsequent awakening. He had questioned every nurse and every doctor who had been involved in her care. But nothing. No answers. That night, he found himself back in his office at the hospital, poring over Sarah's files once again. He pulled up every scrap of information he had, hoping that one overlooked detail might offer a breakthrough. Hours passed, but nothing stood out. Nothing except one thing, a name. The name was tucked away in the corner of a police report, a minor detail that hadn't seemed important at the time but now stood out like a red flag. A man named Edward Rhodes. The name was tied to an investigation that had begun shortly before Sarah's collapse. It was a missing persons case, a wealthy businessman who had disappeared without a trace. Michael had dismissed it earlier, thinking it was unrelated. But now, as he looked at the name again, something in his gut told him it wasn't a coincidence. Michael didn't waste any time. He grabbed his coat and headed straight for the police department. If there was even the slightest chance that Edward Rhodes was connected to Sarah's situation, he needed to know. He needed to find the missing piece of the puzzle. When he arrived at the police station, it was late, past midnight, but the officers on duty were still working, sorting through paperwork, answering calls. Michael walked up to the front desk, his face determined. "I need to speak with Detective Harris," Michael said, his voice firm. "It's about the Rhodes case. I believe it's connected to a patient I'm treating." The officer behind the desk eyed him suspiciously but nodded. "One moment." A few minutes later, Detective Harris emerged from the back, his tired eyes narrowing as he approached Michael. "Dr. Sanchez, what brings you here at this hour?" Harris asked, his tone cordial but clearly curious. "I've been looking into the Rhodes case," Michael said, cutting straight to the point. "I think there might be a connection between Edward Rhodes and one of my patients. Her name is Sarah Whitaker. She woke up from a coma recently, and she's been speaking about a man named Edward Rhodes." Harris paused, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "Rhodes? The missing businessman?" "That's the one," Michael confirmed. "Sarah has been describing him, saying he's been appearing to her in her dreams. She's convinced he's real, and the more I look into it, the more I believe there's something to it. I need your help, Detective. What do you know about Rhodes?" Harris sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's a strange case. Rhodes disappeared about a year ago, shortly before Sarah collapsed, actually. No trace of him was ever found. We assumed he'd fled the country, but there's been no sign of him. His family's been pushing hard for answers, but every lead we've followed has turned up nothing." Michael's heart skipped a beat. It was a year ago. Exactly the same time Sarah had fallen into her coma. The coincidence was too much to ignore. "Do you have any details about his disappearance? Any connections to Sarah?" Michael asked, his voice tight with urgency. Harris shook his head. "Not that we've found. But there was one strange thing. Rhodes was a philanthropist, heavily involved in charities, especially ones that dealt with rare medical conditions. Some of his donations were channeled through a foundation that supports research into sleep disorders and coma-related conditions. That's something we've been trying to dig into. We haven't made much progress, though." Michael's mind raced. Sleep disorders. Coma-related conditions. That was where Sarah's case had started, her coma, her mysterious awakening. And now, Edward Rhodes was tied to a foundation that focused on the very things that had been plaguing Sarah. "I need to see everything you have on Rhodes and his foundation," Michael said, his voice insistent. "There has to be something here. There's a connection, Detective. I can feel it." Harris seemed to hesitate for a moment before nodding. "All right. I'll get you what we have, but you'll have to sign a non-disclosure agreement. This is still an active investigation. Michael didn't hesitate. Fine. I'll sign whatever you need me to. Just give me the information. It took another hour before Harris returned with a thick file. Michael took it eagerly, scanning through the pages as he walked out of the station and back to his car. As he drove back to the hospital, the pieces were slowly starting to fall into place. Edward Rhodes, a missing man with ties to Sarah's medical condition, a philanthropist with an interest in coma-related research. The coincidences were piling up, but Michael needed more than just coincidences. He needed answers. Back at the hospital, Michael went straight to Sarah's room. She was awake, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes were clear and alert. She looked up as he entered, her lips parting as if to speak. But before she could say anything, Michael cut her off. "I need you to tell me everything," he said urgently. "Everything about the man you've been seeing. Tell me about Edward Rhodes." Sarah's eyes widened in shock. She had never mentioned his name to Michael before. How did he know? I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, her voice trembling. "How do you know his name?" Michael sat down beside her, his expression hardening. "Tell me, Sarah. Please. It's important." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "He's the one who's been with me," she said, her voice shaking. "He's the one who's been talking to me in my dreams. I've seen his face, his eyes, he's real. He's been trying to tell me something. He's not just a dream." Michael's heart raced. This was it. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. But what did it mean? "Sarah," he said softly, "do you know where he is? Can you help me find him?" Sarah shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't know. But he's here. I know he's here. He's waiting for something." The fear in her voice was palpable, and Michael knew they were running out of time. Something was coming. Something they couldn't see yet, but it was closing in. Michael's mind was spinning as he tried to process everything. The missing businessman, the man in Sarah's dreams, the connection between them. But one thing was clear, whatever was happening, it was far bigger than either of them could have imagined. The search for the truth was only beginning. The morning air was thick with anticipation. Dr. Michael Sanchez felt a wave of dread settle over him as he stood outside Sarah Whitaker's hospital room, staring at the door. The days leading up to this moment had been an emotional roller coaster, and everything had led to this final confrontation. Sarah had been more insistent than ever, Edward Rhodes was real, and she wasn't just imagining him. The more Michael tried to rationalize her claims, the more undeniable the truth became. It was no longer about medical diagnoses or logical explanations. It was something deeper. Something that defied every known principle of science and medicine. It was a mystery that had wrapped itself around Michael's life, suffocating him with its unanswered questions. Yet, he had come to a chilling realization: there was something important about to happen, something that would answer everything. Today, Michael had arranged to meet with Detective Harris again. He couldn't ignore the foundation Rhodes had been linked to, nor could he dismiss the strange connection it seemed to share with Sarah's case. It all seemed too intertwined to be a coincidence. But there were still holes in the story. The foundation, the missing man, and Sarah's bizarre condition, they all led to a point where the truth could not be ignored any longer. Michael stepped into Sarah's room with purpose. She sat upright in her bed, looking fragile yet determined. The dim light from the window cast long shadows on her face, but her eyes were clear, and there was a flicker of something in them, hope, perhaps, or fear. Michael could never quite tell. "Sarah," he began, his voice soft but firm. "I've been looking into Edward Rhodes. The more I dig, the more it feels like this is all connected to something much bigger than either of us. I need you to trust me. Whatever this is, we have to confront it head-on. Sarah's eyes widened at the mention of Rhodes' name, and she swallowed hard before nodding. I knew you'd figure it out eventually, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. He's been trying to tell me something. It's like he's waiting. I don't understand what it all means, but I know it's important. Michael pulled up a chair next to her and sat down. He didn't know what to make of Sarah's cryptic words, but the time for hesitation was over. They were running out of time. They had to find out what this was, once and for all. You've mentioned dreams, visions, Michael said, his voice calm yet urgent. Tell me again what happened the night you woke up. What did you see? I need you to be specific, Sarah. Every detail could be important. She nodded slowly, her eyes drifting upward as if trying to recall the exact moment. I remember waking up, but it wasn't just waking up from sleep. It felt like I was coming out of something much deeper. A place where time doesn't exist. It was dark, but there was light around me. And then, there was him. Edward. Michael's breath caught in his throat. Was it just a dream? Or was he there in the room with you? He was there, she replied, her voice quiet but filled with certainty. Not in the room. But in my mind. I could feel him. He was speaking to me, telling me things that I couldn't fully understand. It's like, he's trying to communicate something urgent, something that has to happen soon. Michael leaned forward, trying to piece together her fragmented words. What was he saying? Do you remember anything specific? Sarah closed her eyes as if concentrating, her face tightening with effort. It wasn't clear, but there were words, about time running out, about something dangerous approaching. He kept saying, it's almost over, but it's not too late. And then, there was a symbol. A kind of mark, but not like anything I've seen before. Tell me about the symbol, Michael urged, his curiosity piqued. I don't know if I can describe it well, Sarah said, her voice faltering. It was like a circle with lines cutting through it, like a clock, but the lines were jagged, like something was breaking through. It felt like a warning. A countdown. Michael sat back in his chair, processing her words. A countdown. A warning. This wasn't just some random dream or hallucination. This was something deliberate. He needed more information. And he needed to act fast. I'll find the symbol, Michael said, standing up. We need to understand what it means. There's something about Rhodes Foundation, something that connects all of this. I'm going to meet with Detective Harris again, and we'll find out everything. But just as he turned to leave, Sarah called out to him. Michael, she said, her voice filled with urgency. Don't trust them. Don't trust anyone who's been involved in this. They know more than they're letting on. Edward, he's been trying to protect me from them. He's trying to tell me the truth, but they've hidden it. Michael froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Who, Sarah? Who's hiding the truth? I don't know yet, she said, her eyes wide with fear. But there's something about Rhodes, something that people don't want you to know. I just know it. Michael was about to say something more when a knock came at the door. He turned to see Detective Harris standing in the doorway, his face tight with concern. We need to talk, Harris said, his voice low and urgent. Now. Michael nodded, following the detective down the hallway, his mind racing. They walked into the small conference room, where Harris pulled out a folder from his briefcase. I've got something for you, Harris said, setting the folder down on the table. I dug into Rhodes Foundation. You were right to be suspicious. There's more to this than just philanthropy. I found something buried deep in their records, something they tried to hide. Michael's pulse quickened. What did you find? Harris slid the folder across the table, and Michael opened it, scanning the documents inside. The first page was a list of donations to various medical research organizations. But as he flipped through the pages, one document stood out, a research grant given to a company that specialized in experimental coma treatments. "That's it," Michael said, his voice a whisper. "This is it. Rhodes was funding research into coma revival, but this is different. It's not just about waking people up. It's about something more." Harris nodded grimly. "I found more details on the company. They were working on a project that involved not just reviving patients, but manipulating their consciousness, creating a bridge between the physical and the metaphysical. There were rumors that they had made breakthroughs, but they were dismissed as conspiracy theories. That is, until now." Michael's mind was racing, connecting dots faster than he could process them. This is what Sarah's been experiencing. It's not just a coma. It's something more, a manipulation of the mind, something beyond what we can explain. Harris leaned forward. "Exactly. Rhodes wasn't just donating money to medical causes, he was involved in something far more dangerous. And now, Sarah's waking up. She's the result of an experiment. But she's not the only one." Michael stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. The pieces were finally coming together, but there was still one last mystery to uncover. "Sarah was the test subject," Michael said, his voice shaking. "But now she's connected to something much bigger. She's not alone. There are others out there, people who've gone through the same thing." Harris's face grew darker. "I think you're right. And whoever's behind this, they're not going to stop until they get what they want." The countdown Sarah saw, "It's real. We're running out of time." Michael turned and rushed back to Sarah's room. He had to warn her. He had to make her understand what was happening before it was too late. When he arrived, Sarah was standing by the window, staring out at the world beyond. She didn't turn when he entered, but her voice echoed through the room, filled with a strange mixture of fear and determination. "It's starting," she whispered. "I can feel it. Something's coming. And it's too late to stop it." The room seemed to grow colder as Michael walked toward her, the weight of everything finally crashing down on him. The mystery, the danger, it was all real. The countdown had begun. But what would happen when time ran out?